Joseph, as a newsman, and of course you started out almost 20 years ago, but when have you seen such significant breaking news, and what time in your career compares to the last few years? And thirdly, how do you handle it?
It's a mouthful, Jen. Yeah. I've been doing, WND for the last 18, but I've been a newsman for 40 years. And in that 40 years, I've never seen anything like what we're seeing today. I mean, almost on a daily basis, we have news stories that boggle the mind, literally. And I'll just give you one quick example on that. I mean, we can talk about same-sex marriage, and we can talk about a lot of things like that. But just this massive hacking attack on the federal government, where the identities of every federal employee, past and present, were compromised and probably are in the hands of, Chinese intelligence and who knows who else at this point. Now, if you remember back a few years ago, there was one CIA agent who was compromised, Valerie Plame, and you remember the news cycle was nonstop about Valerie Plame. What a horrible guy, even went to jail.
That's right.
For that, Scooter Libby. Compare that with this story, and the reverberations are nowhere near as great with this. Really, I mean, I don't know what to do. I mean, things are happening so fast. Everything is on overdrive, hyperdrive, and the news cycle, nobody can keep up with it. And at the end of the day, this is what we would expect, I think, as people who are, Bible literate.
Yes.
I mean, I think, Daniel talks about everything happening so fast, travel and all these things in the last days. Knowledge increased. Sometimes I wonder about that, but it's not wisdom, it's knowledge.
Yes.
And we see these things happening. And to me, it's just, it suggests, if you weren't convinced already, that we are in the last days.
Yeah. Well, you referenced your career starting 40 years ago. What's fascinating, and I'm aware of it, we may even have referenced it before on the program. We have lots of new listeners. But, Joseph, you started out with a progressive mindset. You were one of those guys on the left, and now you're a very staunch conservative. How did that happen?
Yeah, very far left, by the way. I mean, Jen, you would not recognize me
really?
Back then. First of all, I had a conversion in the latter part of my college years, but I had already been motivated to go into the media as this young progressive because, just like everybody else who goes into the media, I wanted to change the world, remake it in my own image. And so that's what motivated me in that direction in college. Well, after college, I certainly started moving away from the progressive views that you referenced. But, slowly but surely, that was not, the born-again experience did not turn my worldview upside down. It took a while for that to happen. As a young person in the media, I was already a Christian and certainly moving in the direction of more conservative views. And a lot of folks wonder, well, how can that even be? How can you operate in the mainstream media and operate at a high level? I mean, I was actually on a career trajectory that would have, I was running daily newspapers when I was 26 years old. So, and, how can that be that a conservative Christian could get that far in the media world? Well, that's how much things have changed. That was the 1980s, and it was entirely possible for somebody with my views and worldview to advance. I don't think that's possible today in this environment, this crazy environment that we live in, where Christians are being, subjected to persecution like we could never have imagined back then.
I think a lot of people, and obviously you've got huge readership, WorldNet Daily, WND.com, and I think you indicated you've got as many as 6 million unique readers, which has to tick off the left when they hear stats like that. And from some other conservative outlets, I'm not sure they can compare to that. But the thing I hear from people, Joseph Farah, and that's who I'm talking to for this segment, is, people get up in the morning and no matter what headline they're looking at, and a few still look at hard copies, but no matter what headline they're looking at, that takes their breath away just because another major story has broken, which is how we started talking about this issue of how do you keep up. I saw a troubling story the other day, and I want to play off of it, and the story is that let's see here, 25% of Muslims in America think that it's okay to have violence against Americans. In other words, Muslims living in America, 25% of them think it's okay that the rest of Americans get whatever persecution comes to them. And I'm going back to an article that you wrote. You wrote it a couple months ago. I don't have the title of the article, but I have a couple of paragraphs, and I want to read a couple of paragraphs that you wrote. And it plays into this headline I just referred to. And you write, America has changed dramatically in the last 100 years. Back then, immigrants from the Middle East were nearly all Christians, most of whom were looking for a country in which they would not be dominated and oppressed by a population of largely Muslims who often treated non-Muslims like second-class citizens. They didn't come to America to fundamentally transform it. Rather, they came to assimilate, to learn the language, adapt to the culture, obey the laws, raise families, build businesses, pay taxes, live in freedom. Then you go on to write, Joseph, as the grandson of Joseph Farah and Alexandra Kurdock, I wonder where I can go to live out that dream, or where my children and grandchildren might be able to go. I thought about this as I read the latest story in WND about plans to flood America with tens of thousands of refugees from my old homeland, nearly all of them Sunni Muslims. And then you write and you conclude, and I'm not reading the whole article, if we want to be a land of compassion to real refugees, I'm all for it, but that's not the case here. We're opening up America not to the victim, but to the oppressors. It's not Sunnis who are being beheaded by ISIS. They represent the only group not being beheaded. ISIS is conducting a scorched earth policy against Shiites, against Christians, and against other religious minorities. And then you conclude, and I'm skipping parts of the article, as for me and my offspring, my children and my grandchildren, where will we go when America completely loses connection with its Christian roots and heritage? What new world can we dream about as America's new god of multiculturalism self-immolates in its suicidal embrace of Islam? Where will you go? Now, Joseph Farah, that's a bit of a rhetorical question because I think the point is there's nowhere else to sail to or fly to. Would that be correct?
Jen, you're absolutely right. When I was putting that column together, I was actually thinking about a longer period of time than the last 100 years. That has happened to play into the fact that my grandparents came here about 100 years ago. But, if you think back 400 years, think back to the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, 400 years, people all around the world who longed for freedom, particularly religious freedom, particularly Christians who were fleeing persecution, they had a place to go called the United States of America. What's happened, and really I think it's become very visible just in the last few years, maybe even the last 6 months, we are seeing that America is no longer a hospitable place for Christians. Officially, as that article points out, we are throwing out the welcome wagon for really hundreds of thousands of Sunni Muslims. You can blame multiculturalism, you can blame all kinds of, reasons for that, but at the end of the day, this is what Barack Obama wants. It's what one person wants. The Congress of the United States has not deliberated about this. The people have had no say. I have to say, God bless Donald Trump for even raising this issue. He's the only person on the national scene that I can think of who has effectively raised this issue. Why are we bringing in so many Sunni Muslims? And he says, as president, he will try to get Christians to open up America for Christian refugees. Isn't that what we should be doing, considering the history of our nation, considering the fact that this is why America was created? This is what the founders were all about. We've enshrined religious freedom in the First Amendment. And, my whole life is about the First Amendment: free expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. And I'm seeing those things fade away here very quickly. The polls show that Americans think that Christians who are in positions like the photographer or the florist who gets asked to participate in a same-sex marriage, for instance, almost 50% of Americans, according to the polls, say they should be forced to do so. I mean, it is crazy, mind-boggling stuff that's going on, the way this nation is being transformed. And long story short is there is no other place we can go. We don't have the dreams and aspirations that our ancestors did for the previous 400 years. This is it. America, this is the best we've got. My only hope and prayer is that the believers here I'm not talking about the non-believers. I'm not talking about all those bad people out there, those sinners. But the believers need to, follow that prescription in 2 Chronicles 7:14 and take it very seriously, because I think that's the only hope we have right now of saving those great things about America. The only other thing we have to look forward to is the kingdom of God.